Welcome to Virtual Sentiments. I'm your host, Kristen Collins. On today's episode, I talked to Dr. Deva Woodley, professor of political science at Brown University. Much of our conversation draws from her recent book, Reckoning: Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements. Since the early 2010s, commentators have often cast the movement for Black lives as the result of changes in digital technology. While the original development of the Black Lives Matter hashtag and the ease of capturing bystander videos and photography of police brutality and of disseminating these images on social media have been important parts of understanding the rise of the social movement, Deva's work shows us the complex and challenging work of activists and organizations in cultivating and sustaining the movement. Drawing on interviews with organizers, she articulates the movement's incipient political philosophy, radical Black feminist pragmatism. As she argues, the social movement offers us an alternative vision of politics that centers human flourishing from the margin to the center and builds from the bottom up. She shares with us a wealth of insights about the importance of a vibrant civil society and associational life, both for social movements and for democracy more broadly. We recorded this episode on May 13th, a month ago, and I am recording our intro and recap recordings on June 9th. I can't help but think about the images I've seen over the weekend, and especially this morning, of police brutality in response to demonstrations against immigration and customs enforcement raids in LA, as well as President Trump's order deploying Federal Service National Guard troops against the wishes of local and state authorities. I'm not sure what will happen between the time of this recording and when you actually get a chance to hear this episode, which we will be releasing on June 18th, the day before Juneteenth. Right now, what stands out to me is Deva's reminder that this political moment is a moment of backlash that itself illustrates the potency of the ideas associated with the movement for Black lives, just as past moments of progress also faced backlash. These potent ideas include the demand to treat every single person, whether they are suspected of a crime, whether they have come to this country having met all the many bureaucratic and legal requirements, as though they are not disposable. Deva helps us see that no matter how overwhelming building an alternative vision may feel, we achieve it in the small daily actions that we take in our communities, including spaces like churches and workplaces, where we build skills of communication and collaboration, including the skill of cooperating, not just despite, but through critique and disagreement. I'm so grateful Deva took the time to talk with us, and I hope you learn as much and feel as hopeful as I did listening to her.
I am so excited to talk to you today, Deva, about all these issues about democracy, about anti-Black racism, about especially the political philosophy that you also develop out of your book, which is radical Black feminist pragmatism, as well as these broader themes that are so central to your work, the role of social movements in democracy, the idea of the way that we shape notions of common sense from your first book as well. And what I really love is how you discuss social media and technology and how these play a role in social movements and democracy, but you teach us why we shouldn't just make everything kind of techno-determinate. Like we shouldn't say that all these changes are because technology has democratized the media, let's say, all those things, because we can't take politics for granted. It's something that people are actively contributing to together, especially in a democracy. And so thank you so much for talking with us today.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
I figured a good way for us to get started would be the other aspect of this podcast is it's both about technology and democracy, but it's also about giving a historical perspective to our moment. And so I thought just by way that we could kind of get into this, especially this is something talked about in some of the other episodes of this season. We are now in President Trump's second term, though we had Biden's term between it. And I thought it would be useful to kind of give us a little bit of a narrative of how we got here in terms of what's going on in America, trying to fight against the type of oppressive policies that we're seeing today, that are in some ways, the policies that are anti-immigration, very strong state power. But to kind of deal with this moment, we should know that we have people who have been fighting against state surveillance and state oppression and state violence for a long time. And so maybe seeing the way that we might have hope from the way people, especially in the movement for Black Lives, have been reckoning with these issues since, let's start with maybe Ferguson in 2014.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a little bit about the historical moment. So I think that a lot of times people want to sort of understand this historical moment by looking back at the middle 20th century, but that is the wrong moment to look at. So the mid 20th century civil rights movement, the women's movements, and the labor movement of that time are not the corollary moments to our moment. Our moment is more analogous to the turn of the 20th century. That's what we're looking at right now. So, what we're looking at now is a moment in which the American order is being fundamentally changed, in which there is a disconnect between the ways people have come to expect their lives to unfold and the ways that they are actually unfolding, a deep frustration with this schism and disconnect. And so all of the social maladies that arise from that kind of disconnect are also corollaries here. We also have a similar kind of situation in terms of the anti immigrant sentiment, the rise in labor militancy, although it's not at the level that it was obviously in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but it's arising for many of the same reasons. Same with the anti-immigrant sentiment, as well as the sort of demagoguery of political parties and factions and a right-wing political coalition that seeks to stoke these divides. We also have our own robber barons in this situation, much, much more virulent actually than the 20th century robber barons, because they are not only interested in making enormous profits within the confines of a market economy in a nation state. They want to exceed the nation state because they actually need markets that are bigger than what a nation state can provide. And they would like to remain utterly unregulated, not just by the laws of their own nation, but the laws of nations in general. It's just kind of a serious question and conflict, because this is a moment when the old order is breaking down and a new order is emergent. This is a time, therefore, of great danger, but also one of great opportunity. And that is the one, that is the side that I try to emphasize with people, and the side that we have to really think about how to nurture and nourish, because there are those who already have a plan for the building of the next world. And the question is, for those of us who are not interested in a techno feudalist, white nationalist, anti cosmopolitan new world order, where regular, ordinary people are more isolated, poorer, more ignorant, and more prone to death and disease, then we have to nurture a different vision and practice of a new world. And that's honestly where my new work is taking me. It's also where I end in the last book, Reckoning. And so I'm really pushing off from that point, utilizing a lot of the things that I think I learned from studying the Black Lives Matter movement, but also 21st century social movements in general. We have been in what political scientist Sidney Tarrow calls a cycle of contention for the entirety of the 21st century. And it's because for the entire time, the 20th century world order has been kind of breaking down. And so then the question is, what does the 21st century order look like? That is, what is being contested right now, what is being built right now, and it's being pursued and built in a variety of different ways. And so that is the order of my work right now, I think.
No, I love hearing that. That is exactly what I'm concerned about, and building out this community of people of how do we take this moment and not let the forces of techno-feudalism, white nationalism win out. And that means we need to create an alternative vision. And so I totally agree with you. And I love, before we get into, because I do want to get into that, that'll be great. We can talk about social movements more broadly, because I think a lot of people, there's kind of maybe certain myths and certain oversimplifications of like social movements and how they fit into democracy. And so one way into this that we could start with is maybe also just transitioning from that historical perspective as well. You were talking about why we need to be comparing this to the 20th century, the turn of the 20th century, rather than the mid-century movements. And so maybe what are some of the differences between this moment and why the mid-century movements are not the right analog for us?
Well, I think one of the main differences is that the mid century movements were relying on a civil society that had been created at the turn of the 20th century. And so they had a very robust civil society. What do I mean by civil society? I mean those groups, many mostly non political groups, or at least their main charter is not political, but they're places where people gather for the purpose of doing something together, whether they're social clubs, whether they are, the old like Elks Lodges and other kinds of secret societies, whether they're mutual aid groups, whether they're neighborhood associations. There were even at that time organizations that still exist had different form, right? So national organizations tended to be membership organizations where people had local chapters and paid dues and created autonomous projects locally. It wasn't like a more subscription based model, which is what we have now, even for those national organizations that have existed the entire time. The model now is, send a check and maybe attend a gala once a year. It's a really, really different organizational model than the one that was dominant at mid century. So that means that the infrastructure for social movements in the middle of the 20th century was really, really different than what we have now. And the turn of the 20th century is more akin to that moment because that is when post Reconstruction, all of those institutions were getting built. A huge variety of institutions, very diverse institutions. It's when the fraternities and sororities that we know today were founded and built, right? A lot of these organizations were segregated, but they were so proliferate that most communities had a number of civil society institutions to rely on as basically their social fabric. And that social fabric has been fraying, honestly, since the mid 20th century. And so we find ourselves in a really different situation in that we, like our grandparents and great grandparents, are going to need to be the ones who are nurturing and creating the space for those civil society institutions because those are the institutions upon which strong democratic citizenry is built. And those are the kinds of institutions and the kind of social substrate which can rescind authority from a ruling party, right? Um, those are the places from which ordinary citizens can stand and say no because this is the place that supports me, right? These are the people who actually nurture me. These are the places where I develop a political analysis. This is where I build trust so that I don't believe propaganda, right? And so this moment is actually a moment where we have to be really refocusing our attention somewhat counterintuitively on that level of building, much more so, I think, than the mass protest, right? Because one of the things that we have missed, it's not that mass protest is not important, it is, it's very important. But one of the things that we miss about the power of the mid 20th century mass protests across a variety of issues and modalities is that all of those mobilizations were built on deep organization, right? That lived in a robust civil society. And you cannot skip this step That's one of the things that's really important to understand about our technology, right? The communications technology is that, and I was actually just talking with a group of organizers about this, is that there has been a historically unique divergence between mobilization and organization because our communication technology allows us to skip a step, right? You can now bring many people into the street. It still takes a lot of effort, but you can now bring a lot of people into the street without that foundational step of creating the organizations that build trust and community and support and resilience. And you can't actually skip that step. That's really critically important for democratic organizing.
Yes, yeah, and part of that is the importance of the face-to-face interactions that people are having and developing that trust and developing that also, I think, a sense of the stakes of the situation and a commitment to each other in the situation. And I why do you think we've lost so much, I have other questions related to this, but just again, saying a little bit in this prehistoric not prehistorical,
Prehistoric.
you know what I mean? um, but like this other
I don't
historical
know anything
moment.
about dinosaur organizing.
Yeah. Oh, shucks. That's the future of the democratic theory of social movements is how did the dinosaurs, I mean, talk about an apocalyptic dark time. Anyway, so in this other historical moment, why do you think we've lost that sense of the importance of civil society and of the fact that it's? I want to use so for my work, Eleanor Ostrom's work on polycentricity is the way that I would think about this in terms of like nesting structures, different having kind of these local community levels. So why do you think? We have this misperception, a lot of Americans, about the way that these movements occurred in the 20th century, and miss how much, or see them as these mass movements, as mass actions, and miss all that work that had to happen and all those one-to-one relationships that had to be developed within smaller chapters, local organizations.
Well, I think there's several answers to that question. One, we have a certain structural limitations, right? It's not as though we are the ones who have disappeared these structures from society. They have sort of disappeared slowly over time because changes in the political economy, and then also changes in culture that follow changes in the political economy. What do I mean by that? I mean, more and more of our time, more and more of our hours are reserved for or colonized by waged work. And that has been something that has been basically in process since the late 70s, and definitely accelerated in the 80s. And that's when we see the precipitous decline in civil society institutions, right? This is all stuff that we know, right? This is based on Robert Putnam's work, right? Starts coming out in the late 90s, right? The book Bowling Alone comes out in 2001. So this is all stuff that we have known. But we have not considered its political significance, right? It's sort of one of those things where it's like everybody cites it, some people read it, but we have not considered its political significance. And which is ironic because every single democratic theory 101 class will, give you all of these books from the 1700s that say, what's really necessary for a democracy to form? A robust civil society, right? And it's something that we just took for granted because one of the brilliant things about the mid 20th century is that it really built up its own mythology as the pinnacle of human achievement and the always society, right? So even though it was actually freshly made, right, freshly minted,
Yeah,
right, like
yeah,
brand new,
yeah.
um, you know, um, and there was such enormous changes from 1900 to say 1960 in like every conceivable way. All of that was built. None of it was inevitable, right? Those were big swings that were taken from a variety of different disciplines, from economics to the arts, right, to sociality, like huge changes. But part of making it work was the creation of this mythology as that it would be ever thus, right? And this is the whole end of history mythology too, right? Which develops and emerges. So you're trying to characterize what in reality is a very short span of time as a kind of norm. It wasn't, right? It wasn't. And so I think that during that time, people forgot, and it was a little bit of a manufactured forgetting as well, right? What it actually takes to build a democratic society, let alone a stable democratic society, right? That takes a lot of work from many, many different sectors. And a lot of that work we stopped doing in favor of the pursuit of a particular kind of, ever increasingly deregulated financial capitalism and a social welfare state that, after especially the fall of the Berlin Wall, right, became more and more disinvested in because it was more and more maintained by ideas and ideology and less underpinned by a kind of practical necessity of differentiating, right, or holding off the threat of another way of being in the world. So, it's kind of it's the problem with a monopoly, right? Right? A monopoly of ideas and a monopolistic kind of way of living. It starts to it starts to deteriorate. And so it has been for the last 2 decades. We've known it. We haven't done anything about it. We haven't understood the significance. And I include myself here, right? And this is what I study. I study social movements. But I hadn't taken seriously until recently what it means for civil society to be so thin. It's not just a fun fact, it's a question of people power, right? And I think it's also been a kind of misstep in political science, which is my discipline, because we've taken the underpinnings of the democratic society for granted, right? Since the mid 20th century. And so, um, sort of none of our political questions are suited. Like none of our like sort of like methodologies and ways of sort of thinking about politics are suited to moments like this one, critical junctures where basically reconstruction is necessary. And thinking about what happens, not just when you have democratic backsliding, we have literatures that deal with that, but what it means, like what you do when the question is not one of quote development, right? But instead, it's one of how these sorts of societies get built and rebuilt once they've been challenged.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think those are excellent insights, and I completely agree with your emphasis on how much, even though political science, we've talked so often about Putnam and about social capital, but we don't often talk about what that really means for democracy. And so one way into this, further deeper into this, that I wanted to ask you about, because I was thinking about this when I was reading your book, and I was also thinking about this because we talk about Tocqueville in our programs a fair amount, and so Tocqueville, paradigmatic example of this canonical classic text, is like democracy really depends on civil society and the art of association, civil associations, voluntary associations. So I want to propose to you something. I don't know if this is something you've seen sometimes in the way people receive or talk about Tocqueville, but it seems like sometimes people who have really embraced Tocqueville sometimes embrace civil associations as distinct from political associations. And so there's this sort of, because I think when you read Tocqueville, you see that he's also talking about local municipal government. He's talking about political associations specifically. And so the idea of us being able to engage with each other is both about these maybe less controversial projects that towns might come together to do, but it's also about talking about, having political parties. It's about having, debates about actual political work, because your book, what you were talking about was in Reckoning, you discussed how part of what the movement for Black Lives Matter movement does is it repoliticizes society. And I think for some people, they are afraid of that. They are maybe wary of politicizing things that causes conflict, that causes disagreement or tension. But when we have such so many structural problems in terms of our political institutions, seems like the only way for us to get at this is for us to face these questions together. And so we maybe need to not be so wary of the sort of political aspect of these associations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that people are so afraid of politics and political conflict is because we don't have the associational infrastructure to deal with conflict. Like, we actually don't have the routines that a democratic people need, right? In order to mitigate, deal with, work through conflict, right? That's what these associations are for. But I would also say that I don't think that there's a very hard line, unless we make one, between non-political civic associations and political civic associations. The truth is, civic associations that this kinds of that we need to be able to do both. And the ones that exist right now do both. This is one of the reasons that one of the most the most, I think, highly effective civic association that still exists. There are two. One are religious institutions, right? And then the two are unions, right? And the reason why religious institutions are so important civically is because they do both, right? Like, and it's really important that their charter and reason for existing is not directly political because they'll remain, right? They're there for support. They're there for community. They're there for relationality. They're there for pleasure. They're there for education, right? And so 90% of what they're going to be doing is going to be not directly political. And yet, there is space from which people organize to do political things, right? That's really, really important. It's very important because this is a kind of civic home where people learn how to be in the world. They learn all the kinds of skills that they need. This is all Schlossman, Berber, Brady, right? They learn all the skills that they need to be public persons, right? And we don't have that many institutions that teach those skills, especially cross class, which is something that they do well. And most of the stuff they're doing isn't political. But the skill set that people get, the relationships they get, the discussions they have, the analyses they develop, all of those can be applied politically and are. And so we don't have to make a hard line. We shouldn't make a hard line between political and non political. We should simply be nurturing those spaces because the more of them we have, the better off we are, particularly those who are democratic and democracy promoting rather than anti democratic. And that's really important to understand. Civic organizations can do any kind of work. They're highly flexible. They can be democratic in their processes and pursue anti-democratic ends. And so, you know, the issue is about nurturing spaces, democratic organizing spaces for democratic ends. And we have fewer of those than we've had in 100 years. And that is really where the work is. And it's also the case that through developing those kinds of relationships, people will become less scared of politicization because everybody wants a quick fix. Like, people, like, the big rage right now is thinking about polarization, right? And it's like there's no way to fix polarization on the back end, right? Like, once you're in a high stakes political environment, which is genuinely high stakes, right? By which people will live or die, by which people will have their rights or have them taken away, by which people will be disappeared to foreign prisons, right? Or not, right? Like, it's genuinely high stakes. There is no amount of kumbaya that makes that not high stakes or civility, right? Or all of these things that are proffered. They are not gonna work, right? And they shouldn't, right? You have to build against polarization on the front end, not the back end. And that front end is civil society spaces. That's where people develop relationships across difference for some local common good. It allows people to discuss differences before they become so high stakes. It shapes people's opinions in different ways. It focuses their attention on problems that they can solve. This is why they're important spaces. It solves for polarization on the front end, not conflict. You still have conflict, but you don't have the kind of hardened, calcified is the term of art, right? I think that's what Lynn Vavreck calls it, the calcified polarization that we see. But once you're in the space of calcified polarization, there's no way to fix that through civility, right? You really have to invest in these civic organizations.
Yes, because exactly, and because Philly, those types of calls, those types of like tone policing type of discussions are often read as not acknowledging and not recognizing the problems that are happening, and also as dismissing what people are concerned with, which is not is just I think digging us deeper into the problems to begin with, because we're not going to be.
Yeah, and also not solving problems, right? Like the civility discourse is not about solving problems, it's about not fighting, which is not useful. We have to fight to like there are
Yeah.
things to fight about. So the question is, how do we do that, right?
No, exactly. And I think you're totally right. So that those types of interactions that we have in these types of spaces allow us. This is the other thing that what I liked, but you know you already hit on this before you brought up Putnam, but the idea that we took for granted a certain structure of civil society and democracy that enabled these types of development of social capital. And sometimes people see. They look at what is happening right now, and so they'll see communities where there are social capital, and they'll kind of treat it as though that's just something that we have to find out in the world, and and it's something that exists because people have we already have these common shared views or shared goals or shared identities or something. But in actuality, it is, and and it's actually, I think, to some degree Tocqueville gets at this himself, and where it's actually in coming together and having to solve a problem that we then develop those connections too. Actually, these things, we don't need to, we build social capital through these spaces and by overcoming challenges together, not just by virtue of it already existing.
No, it's made, and it's not made via similarity. Like, that's the other thing is, like, we have to be like each other in order to that's actually not how it works. We do things together, and that's how we come to understand who we are. It's also the ways that, people are able to work across differences, right, for a particular goal. They're able to accept certain things. I mean, everybody has been in this situation, right, where you are working with someone you have very different, not necessarily political views, but just like ways of being in the world, right? You're always early, they're always late, right? Like, and sort of different viewpoints to solve a problem, but you have to work with them or you choose to work with them for some reason. And it allows you to sit in a space and say, oh, such and such, oh, yeah, you know how they are, right? And to work through it. And it's like, that's not an obfuscation of your difference. It doesn't mean you'll never have a conflict, but it means that you are able to work with, move past, resolve, right? Those tensions and conflicts, or even use them as a resource, right? And space for knowledge building in order to do the thing you're going to do together. And the thing that democratic society needs is iterations of that over time. And that's what we don't have, right? We don't have, and we don't feel like we have time to do it because we kind of don't, right? And that is, that is how, all of this stuff sort of comes together, right? The failing of the social safety net, the more hours worked, the more and more isolating way that we use technology. It's not that the technology itself is isolating, it's that we use it in isolating ways. All of that serves to put us in a place where we don't know what to do because we're not getting together with anyone else to talk about what to do. And we don't have habits that reassure us that we can figure it out. There's so much comfort in a habit of figuring it out, you know? And we don't have that. So that's one of those things that I think one of those things that I began to understand while interviewing people in movement and being in movement spaces, but that has come to seem even more present for me in these times because I realized that it's not just about those movement spaces, it is also about these civil society spaces, and that is part of the argument that I totally missed. And it's also really important for people who are organizing and in movement spaces because those civil society organizations are also spaces that they return to, right? For support and resilience and context and rethinking and reflection. And so that whole substrate, is critically important. And if I had to write the book again, I would add a piece about that because I think that's another element that's necessary for democracy.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. But, I also think maybe you're a little too hard on yourself because I feel like I picked up on those themes and that part of it as well. I mean, I think especially this is why I really love because I was seeing people talk about recently about like media and how it's impacted the perception of reality and specifically tying that to like the sort of the progress of the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that it picked up speed over time. But what I loved, but some of that again, people can kind of oversimplify things and get a little bit too into the technology of it. Of oh, there's videos of these events and not of these, and that's why how a moving a video can be for people, but it's and people always take that for granted because videos themselves, people interpret them all sorts of ways. So the task of politics is teaching people how to interpret and understand and draw some political implication from what they observe, whether it's online or not. And so what I loved about your account of I mean, I love so much about the book, but one of the things that comes into mind specifically with what you were bringing up was you were talking about Ferguson. How did it become such an incredibly powerful moment, and how did it inspire? How did it lead to a more sustained mobilization or movement? And it was partly you emphasized how much there were the indigenous organizations or the local organizations on the ground in the area that were already thriving and to some degree and already important to the community and how much that played a part and of how people responded to what was going on at the time. So I thought that was great, and I think so. Would you mind going a little bit more into whether in that moment or the history of the movement more broadly of kind of also again problematizing the idea that this isn't just about the technology, but there were all these political actors and actions that had to take place for people to coalesce around these issues.
Oh, absolutely. So by the time Ferguson happened, different movement organizations had been percolating already for a number of years, basically from the time of the murder of Trayvon Martin, right, and that subsequent trial. And what I found when I was interviewing people was that movement requires iterations. So in that moment of the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, a lot of people were sort of caught off guard. And one of the things that started happening is that people started to develop a particular kind of political analysis and different started having conversations, right, about what this meant in the then what was the Obama era, right? And what could be done about it, right? What kinds of organizing would need to be done? Now, a lot of the people who were having these conversations or were just people on the internet, a lot of people were already organizers and across different issues, right? Thinking about, unionizing domestic workers, thinking about, youth leadership, thinking about domestic violence, thinking about migration issues. Like they were already in that field, but then started having conversations about what this meant, right? What this event was about. So, that after several incidents of vigilante and police killings that happened in the subsequent years, many of which were filmed, by the time that Ferguson happens, which is the murder of Michael Brown, and a particularly and the disrespect of his body in a particularly heinous faction, people are already primed, right? People have been having discussion for a couple of years about what they need to do, what is required. And so what happened was that there was just like kind of a massive convergence, right, on this area. And this was an area that already, as you said, had organizations that had been working against police extortion and violence and anti-poverty in ways that had been sustained basically since the 1980s. And so it was the kind of confluence of these, and it was not a conflict-free confluence, right? Like it was not like super smooth, right? But it was nevertheless the confluence of people who had the deep experience and knew the landscape of the area with people who had different skill sets, who came from all over the country to express outrage, yes, but also to assist, right? And to figure out how to create a sustained response that would make a difference. And so that's how you have that confluence there. And the thing about movements is that their time scale, their timeline is always much longer than the sort of picturesque moments of uprising that we tend to sort of like retell in the stories. Pick a movement, any movement that you think of as successful, and I promise you that the time scale for its apotheosis was a decade longer than you think. And so, so it is with the Black Lives Matter movement, which is also ongoing, right? And is also like the movements before it, right? If you study any social movements, this is also what becomes clear, is also in conversation, coalition, sharing personnel and resources with other issue movements that are ongoing at the same time and are also transnational in their scope. We see these moments where we're in cycles of contention, but we often don't give them their due in terms of their complexity, but also their duration. And so, right now is a moment where people across movements in the Black Lives Matter movement, but also across other movements, right, are all in a period of trying to focus and refocus on the new not only attacks, right? That they're having to weather, but also the vision, right? What comes next and how their visions converge and how they push them forward. That's a lot of questions right now, but there are already some answers that are emerging. And this is the other thing is that we often miss the things that social movements make room for because particularly in the social sciences, we're primed to look for because of the methods that we often use, direct causation, right? And we're trying to isolate the variables, which variable causes which thing. But in social movements, almost all of the effects are indirect, right? They're indirect and iterative, and yet they're also measurable and actual, right? They're real. So you see certain things emerging like as the Black Lives Matter movement happens, and many people think of it as a response to police violence, and it is, but it also has an entire political platform that's about investment and divestment, that's about reforming the political economy, that is about a politics of care, that is about a sort of holistic vision for what it looks like to live in a just society. And even though in a sort of like popular imagination or perception, those elements can fall out of the story, in actuality, the institutions that have been seeded and the practices that have been seeded in this time are already sort of making changes, right? And when I say this, I mean in the area of police violence, we have seen the largest investment, even despite all of the hand wringing about defund the police as a slogan. We have seen the largest investment in non police responses that we've ever had in the modern period to the tune of more than $500 million dollars since 2021. And I mean much more than $500 million. Dollars. That's just at the federal level. States also. So we have at least 62 cities and municipalities that have now numbers that you can call for non police responses. It's been these programs are wildly popular and incredibly successful, and they're successful across the board. They're even successful with police. We have so that's sort of a practical outcome. In addition, is the rise of the concept of abolition, right? And not just abolition of police and prisons, but what abolition, the sort of recalling of what W.E.B. Du Bois and then later Angela Davis picked up as the abolition democracy, which is the what kinds of institutions and ideas we would need in order to have a society in which we believed no one was disposable. this is an idea that has been um, wholly revived and is a minority position, but one that is very conversant, right? When you talk about abolition, people no longer automatically think of the 19th century version, right? They have a 21st century notion. That's huge. In addition to that, and this is only something that I've recently discovered in my current research, is that since 2019, and then accelerating after 2020, there's been an enormous explosion in things, investments in what's called the solidarity economy. So, an explosion in the number of co ops that exist in the United States, much more extensive use of this formation of community land ownership called community land trusts. All of these things have increased exponentially in the last 5 years, and they're developing very, very fast, not just in number, but this is really people practically thinking through what it takes, right, to create viable alternatives to the ways that we have been living, not in a kind of, again, mid century, you know, we're in a commune and we're prefiguring, right, et cetera. But instead, like, what does it mean to erode financialized capitalism, basically. And this concept of erosion, I'm actually taking from the work of Eric Olin Wright. And one of the things that he writes about, particularly in this book called "How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century," is about like, look, we don't have to be beholden to the 19th and 20th century options, right? In terms of reforming the political economy. Instead, we should really examine how capitalism itself developed. And what happened was that it was a set of ideas and tools and institutions that slowly eroded the old ways of doing business in the world, of organizing people's work lives, right? It was a slow process, but what happened was that new institutions were built that helped people make sense of their lives in a better way, that were more suited to the aspirations that they had, and they worked, right? And so that is again the task before us. So people who are thinking about solidarity economy stuff are really practical. And what we see happening without again noticing it is that it's already begun, right? People are trying to figure out what this means at scale. They're pushing for new legislation. They're forming transnational cooperatives. And we see a little bump in literature to help us understand this. One of the really good books about this, and this is a theory text, but has some really good information in it, is Bernard Harcourt wrote a book called Cooperation that just came out in 24, and it's a little bit of a map of the idea, but also has so many sort of empirical examples of this already existing. And so that's one of the things that I do find a lot of hope in, is that what's disillusioning is that the old ways, or the ways that we understand of making political change from the middle 20th century, are not suited for this moment, right? So it makes sense that people are like, I don't want to do those things. They don't work. They're right. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to do. There's tons to do. And a lot of it is so promising, but it's about having a practical imagination. It's about learning from periods of history where people were creating new ways of living and being in the world. And it is about letting go of the long 20th century, right? And understanding that we are not going to return. Right? We can only move forward.
Yeah. No, I think that is excellent, and it does give me hope because like you said, what I love about how you discuss these topics in your book is how much you show and you dispel the misconceptions that things like abolition democracy or abolition is utopian in some way. And then instead, they have this pragmatic imagination I was wondering if you could just maybe help give flesh out those concepts. What makes something pragmatic and a pragmatic vision as opposed to the utopian? And I think part of it is what have already said, which is that we already see inklings of this in the world bubbling up or existing, emerging in some way, but just not. It's not the world we have yet.
Yeah, I learned, let me just say that my training as a political scientist did not train me to sort of think about imagination, as a political resource, which is too bad. It should going forward, right? And as a professor, I really do try to do that. But I learned this from being in movement spaces. I remember one of the most affecting things that I would see was that sometimes that you would go into a meeting and people were talking about political strategy, or they were just talking about for a kind of grounding exercise, or something to sort of orient people in a space. They would do this thing where they would reason backward from a future point that had not happened. So a kind of argument in the subjunctive tense, right? Which English is not actually good with the subjunctive. So you would see something, or someone would say, imagine that it is 2070 or 2080, and you are an elder sitting on your porch, and those who we're in coalition with have won. What will we have had to have done? Right? Which is a mouthful in English, right? But what will we have had to have done in order to get to that point? And to me, that really sparked something in me in terms of my understanding of like, oh, this is what they mean by vision, right? It means if you intend to actually build the world, it really does require you to have in mind possible outcomes. And then you have to think, how do we get to those outcomes? Not in the form of utopia, where you sort of like dream up a fully formed, functioning, perfect society that you don't actually ever expect to come online, right? For me, that's what utopia is. You will have people, there are people who will say, no, I mean by utopia what you mean by utopia. And that might be true. But I personally don't use that terminology because, in its original definition, it means something that is not meant to exist. I'm interested in things that are meant to exist. And so it's really important for me to think about, and I think for all of us to think about, and this is what I mean by practical imagination. What does it mean to be rooted in the world as it is, but to seriously think through what it takes to build the world that you want? And for me, this is not just an abstract question. It's not even just a method that is used in movement spaces that I learned from, but also it goes back. If you examine that turn of the century, the turn of the last century, and read the biographies of the people, you have to, they were world builders, right? In this practically imaginative way. And that spirit has been sort of evacuated out of us, and certainly taken out of our methodologies in the social sciences because of this end of history myth. But it wasn't so long ago, right, that people thought that it was their responsibility and duty to take big swings and to make the world they wanted to live in. And guess what? They did. It was not a perfect world. It was not conflict free. It was in no way utopian, but it was dramatically, dramatically different than the world that had come before. So when I talk about practical imagination, I really try to think about, okay, so if we think in these kinds of terms, if we think in the terms akin to the ones that our grandparents, right, or great grandparents, depending on how old you are, were thinking in, and we think about centuries, there's no reason why, 2060 should not be as different from 1960 as 1960 was from 1860, right? But we usually don't think with that level of ambition. But why not? Why not? You know? I think about like, when was penicillin first introduced in a clinical context, right? Like, I mean, it was, you know, It was like in the 1940s, and it wasn't discovered at all until 4 years after my grandmother was born. It completely transformed the world. The same with going off the gold standard, right? At creating a planet, like um so many things, it's the same with the eradication of cholera. Well, let's just reverse the Chicago River, right? Like, let's go to the moon. Can you imagine? Right? Like it's just things that were just incredibly ambitious and required coordination between a bunch of different realms and aspects of society, all contentious, right? There were lots of visions of the future that did not come to fruition, right? And we should go back and study those too, because there's stuff to learn. But nevertheless, that conviction that we had the right and responsibility to make the world that we wanted to live in is one that we definitely need to reclaim, and we can, and that requires a practical imagination. And that just simply means rooted in the world as it is, but intended to create the world that we would like to see.
Yeah, excellent. And I want to ask part of that is so there's like two themes that stick out to me too in terms of developing these visions and after reading your book, and other things we're talking about here. But the first thing I wanted to ask to follow up on that is how does that semi federated structure of the movement help enable this and also help enable this to be a plural process and also then how do we fit technology into this? Because the sort of social media aspect that it diffuses
Full questions
and
here.
we don't have to get into all of it, and it's a lot. But I think it's interesting because on the one hand, there's you point out towards the end, there's some advantages and disadvantages in terms of the fact that there's the reliance on hashtags and those types of social media discourses where it does allow for people to allows for some of these ideas to be more widespread. It also risks certain people, kind of co-opting and misappropriating certain notions. But it goes back to, but I think it's worth bringing into what you were talking about. This is why I think to some degree those civil society organizations and those face-to-face trusting relationships between people are so important. We would never be able to separate out all these changes in our public opinion, all these new policies that you were discussing that were replacing police responses with unarmed support workers, things like that. And also to your point that all these, sometimes people will, again, the sort of bad faith actors try to act like, these are, somehow selfish or self-interested or, privileging some people at the expense of others. But this is a vision of a world that benefits everyone, including people who are themselves complicit in the already oppressive systems that exist, but have their own constrained agency as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing about freedom. I mean, the understanding about freedom that is fundamental, but yet is so rarely carried out is very much like the golden rule, right? Is that actually nobody's free unless everybody's free, which is a thing that we kind of know. We kind of know empirically, but it's not something that is carried out, and especially in times of stress or scarcity, whether the scarcity is genuine or manufactured, we notice this, and so you know, we find ourselves right now in this moment living in the backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement and other 21st century movements. Me Too, the Marjorie Stoneman Taylor, the gun safety sort of movement. Right now, we are in the backlash against the momentum of the 21st century social movements, but that's not unusual, right? That's another thing to understand in the history of social movements globally, but especially in American social movements. Every moment of progress precipitated by a social movement was followed by a moment of virulent backlash, usually more violent than this moment, actually. We forget that even the mid 20th century social movements ended in a raft of assassinations, like straight up murders. So that's one thing, that's sort of context. But the other thing is one of the reasons that the backlash is so virulent is because the ideas are so potent and because people really do hunger for a different way of living in the world. And the sort of consensus and apparatus of the 20th century, especially the later part, which made it one that people were willing to sit with for a while, right? Because more people were benefiting more of the time, even though, of course, there were endemic limitations. That apparatus can no longer sustain, right? And so then the question is, what is the next apparatus? And it's an open question. And the movements of the early 20th, first century started to answer that question. And so right now is a moment of follow through because the answers that the currently ascendant authorities are presenting are answers that make suffering more present in everyone's lives, that play on and promote the basest, most vicious and unpleasant human characteristics and try to elevate them to the stage of virtue. But the thing is that we know about we know about human well-being and happiness. We have a science, right, of human well-being and happiness, and that stuff doesn't pan out, right? It can't sustain isolation, viciousness, the promotion of a lack of empathy. All of these things don't sustain. They create sickness, discontent, and death. And so the question is, what do we offer instead? Right? What do we offer instead? And I think that there's a wealth of things that are beginning to be developed, which is not to say that it's not going to be a hard and long road, right? The 21st century that comes to pass, even if, the people who, if democratic notions, egalitarian, democratic, multicultural, cosmopolitan, ecologically sustainable versions win out, right? Like, won't be a perfect world. It will have issues that are endemic to it. The goal, though, is for those issues to be different, right? The same way that, antiquity had its own endemic problems, but I don't know what they were. They're not relevant to me. So yeah, so I think that that's what I'm interested in, and I feel like it's hard to it's even though whenever I speak to people, I think they get excited because this is something, there's like, oh yeah, well, there's stuff we can do. I think sometimes still people are like, oh, but it's not directly confronting of the ascendance, right, of a regime that is increasingly repressive, et cetera. And it's like, well, people who need and have the skill set to directly confront that regime are, right? And still should. And, those of us who are ordinary folks should support that in all the ways that we can. But the thing is that they actually can't do it without this other part, which we can all be nurturing, right? And creating because this is the substrate, that gathering you're going to have, the meeting that you had, your book group, right? The wine moms, right? The folks who get together in your neighborhood to do the thing. It seems like a small thing, but if we can create these kinds of organizations that sustain over time and provide support and care, and build relationships, that's actually the answer. It's actually the way that you create the kind of democratic society in which autocrats do not emerge to the highest levels of power because we have so many other alternatives, so many other ways of understanding the options that are open to us, and so many other ways to build power. And again, we have that place from which we can stand and say, no, no, I won't engage with this. I can disobey the law because I know that I'm in a context and in a community where even if I can't say that I'm totally safe, right? I do know that there's a place that I can go to, be in, be with, where people will try to take care of me, but also fight for this cause.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think so to reiterate to try to emphasize what I think you're also saying is how important when we feel so overwhelmed by what's happening on the national global level and seeing what's going on around, we also know our own kind of options that we have on the table for ourselves and try to make the effort to build out those connections and those face-to-face relationships, which are going to be essential to prove to each other, look, we can resist and challenge and provide an alternative path forward for the country. And I think also, to your point too, acknowledging that this what's happening right now is what's being offered as the alternative, right? And look at how undesirable it is. Look at I think about how these very basic kind of liberal institutions, the idea of a rule of law, the idea of due process rights, and even and again, due process doesn't assume anything about the person, whether they're guilty or innocent. That's the whole point. Even the guilty deserve due process, and how that's the only way we could assess, and let alone and that and but the importance of, I mean, that's why I am glad that there's already been so much work to try to just challenge the punitive approach to these questions to begin with, because that's its own that's a kind of a step forward beyond just the basic due process notion, right? And then knowing that no one, yeah, that idea of no one being disposable. What would an institution that actually treats institutions and communities and practices, laws that actually treat people in those ways, what would those look like? And how do we get those to be the case? And I think there really is an opportunity also for people to build coalition with people who maybe before were more skeptical of these visions. Now, I hope see that they actually are very much embedded in basic kind of human relationships with people, and the idea that we need to take care of each other, and we can do that institutionally as well. It's not just interpersonal, it's something that we can reflect in the way we design institutions, and the idea of exactly having unarmed support workers to but that people can call when there's a mental health crisis, for example, and how much an impact, as you talk about in your book, how much that reduces gun police killings, gun violence.
But all sorts of other kinds of violence. It's also about it, I must say, a different way of reasoning because, and this is what I also love, is that it also means paying attention to empirical evidence. So, for example, in ways that are not ideological. So much of what sustains the carcerality is ideology. It's not empirical, right? And so, what would it mean to pay attention to the empirical evidence for what actually reduces crime, right? What we know actually reduces crime is the expansion of Medicare, which is an indirect result, the increase of green space in communities, improved, again, civil society, social connection. These are the things that we know, right? Reduce crime, and they incidentally improve well-being, right? Because actually improving well-being reduces crime. So this is what I mean is like this is evidence-based. And so this is one of the things that I love to talk to people about beyond all the sort of statistics. People, statistics don't convince people of anything, even when they're and it's great. You have to collect that data.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
you still need them. They're still valuable.
But at the same time, people are always shocked, right? When I say these are known things, like we already know, right, that these things are true. And this is a reason to do these things that some of our dominant ideologies tell us are superfluous, that they're not hard nosed and hard hitting, they're not, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like breaking down that idea is like, actually, that is what is ideological, right? These things that, we have this ideology that in order to be realistic, we have to be mean and self-depriving and community depriving. And it's all about austerity. And it's this sort of holdover from and a much more intensified version of the kind of like Protestant work ethic, like to the nth degree. And it's like actually what we know about what makes society well and what accomplishes the goals that you say you want, right, is some different approaches. And they're also approaches that make everything more pleasant for everyone. And do we deserve that? I mean, do we? I mean, haven't we gotten to the point where we want something nice? And wouldn't it be nice for someone to tell you that you can have nice things and mean it, right? Not as a fantasy, but actually because that's the way you invest in society, in a society where we can be safe and prosperous and whole and connected.
I completely agree in that idea of focusing on sort of pleasure and well-being and how much that is so important to improving all the problems that we're so concerned about. I hope you don't mind because you've been so generous with your time, but I have one question that I did want to talk about. We didn't get to talk about. It just reminds me of this because I again to the sort of technology issue. A lot of people kind of reduce the social movement of Black Lives Matter to again this very violent imagery that which of course is very important for alerting people to violence, to police brutality, to racism, but it seems like it often also has it can be demoralizing for people to see. I mean, specifically for Black people too, especially. And so much of and you talk about the importance of anger and also and Black joy. And I thought that was such an important emphasis because, to some degree, again, just from the perspective of people who have to witness their own discrimination and violence that their community suffers. It seems like there is also this importance of everyone seeing that being Black is can be beautiful. The community that Black people have together is a space of joy, and that is something that people draw on for challenging and being able to overcome and both these social problems, these political policies and laws, and also creating this alternative vision that will be again a challenge to the punitive system, to state oppression, and to a more peaceful and free society for everyone as well.
Yes, let me back up a little bit because you also asked me a question about the semi federated structure, which ties into the technology question. Because although social movements in the 21st century have been communicatively enabled by the internet and then especially social media when it came on the scene, it has also always been undergirded by organizations. Now, those organizations are not as broadly membership based as they need to be, right? Kind of going forward. And that's partly because of questions of repression, right? During the first Trump administration was after Ferguson and was the creation of this designation, a Black identity extremist, which totally right. Right. So this was, repressive techniques that have been utilized and expanded, right? They were utilized and expanded in, for example, Stop Cop City against Stop Cop City in Atlanta, which is a recent iteration, a coalitional movement between folks in Black Lives Matter, but also folks in environmental movements and folks in labor and abolitionists more broadly, right? But the law was weaponized, repressively weaponized in ways that had been begun in response to the Black Lives Matter movement in 2017 during the first Trump term. So movements were not as membership based as they otherwise might have developed to be because there was also reports of the New York, like the NYPD infiltrating meetings and right. So there were security concerns. And so much was shifted online except for among trusted members for those reasons. Right. That is an impediment, right? I think that has to be overcome because the way that social media works is a fantastic tool for spreading information and for gathering people together. But it is not actually a good place for organizing. Organizing has to happen in person. And so it is only a tool. It is not actually it's not a manifestation of anything on its own, right? And has as many detriments as it has pluses, right? So that's one thing about the technology. The semi federated structure, though, is one that allowed there to nevertheless be a broad organizational base because organizations would be locally rooted and autonomous, but be able to come together in topic based tables, right? What were called tables, what are called labels, to make decisions about particular campaigns, like Mama's Day bailout, which is ongoing, right? That still happens, and other kinds of campaigns that would be undertaken movement wide. And so, federation works really well. I mean, there's a reason why we have a federated structure in the American case. Jefferson and Franklin learned the federated structure from indigenous people who were already here, right? Confederation is actually a relatively old and popular way to organize governance, and it's because it's got a lot of pluses. It helps to preserve that kind of autonomy and plurality while creating the capacity for coordination, strength that otherwise would not exist. Okay, so that's one thing. The technology always has to be understood as a tool, and it's also a tool that's changing, right? The social media environment that existed in the 20 teens is not the one that exists now, right? Twitter is gone and dead. That matters. That matters so much. It's the impact we will only know in retrospect, but it is not an insignificant thing, you know, because it was for a while a forum from which organizers and cultural critics could directly impact national media coverage and shape narratives in ways that are now not possible, right?
Yeah, and it goes back to your points before about the impact on that media coverage and how much like Twitter enabled activists, people on the ground to influence journalism in a way that police authorities were no longer the first, source of information on this, and that's so crucial to that empirical point that you were making before. Sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to underscore how important that empirical aspect is.
But it's also the case that, you know, organizing can never ultimately be based on tools that organizers don't control. And so the ownership of those platforms has changed, the reach, the algorithms have changed, people's attention to them and trust of them has changed. So they're totally different tools now than they were 10 years ago. And that's also important to understand, is that it's about the evolution of communication technology as well. This is why it's even more important to re reinvest in these forms of local gathering that then can become networked in new ways. But movements and people are highly adaptive, right? It's not as though these things can't be used in new ways and aren't being used in new ways. So that's the answer to the old question. But the answer to the current question about the impact of social media and the perpetuation of violent images and the hurt, the pain, the disillusionment that comes with that, and also the perverse effects, right? There's a way in which these kinds of spectacles of violence begin to backfire because they hurt the people who are impacted, or who are empathetic, but thrill people who are not. And so, as you said, there's nothing inherent in the image. It's all about the interpretation. But from very early on in the movement, from quite early on, there were always guidelines and permission structures for people not to consume. Those arose almost immediately, right? To say you don't have to watch this, you don't have to share this, you can focus on other things, and it's because ultimately at the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement is this politics of care. Is this concern a Black feminist concern? I think in terms of arising from the political philosophy of Black feminism of well-being, right? How how can we be well, right? How can we create a space, a community, connections, a politics for those of us, in the words of Audre Lorde, who were never meant to survive, right? So it requires a different kind of ethical orientation, but it's one that I think, again, right now we're living in the backlash of the penetration of these ideas, but it's an idea that was almost immediately taken up one of the things that I knew, one of the moment that I knew that I had to write about this movement was in 2014, after folks in movement started circulating the Audre Lorde quote about self-care, how it was immediately proliferated. Now, of course, it's been entirely commodified, but not entirely, but very commodified by this moment. But I remember thinking at that time, there's no reason for this to spread so fast and so far and so deep, except because it answers a great yearning, a deep yearning that's across class, that's across race, that is global. And what has happened in the sort of aftermath of a moment of late 20th century prosperity is that we actually have come to the point where the political economy and the culture that has arisen to serve it has robbed us of the time and the permission and the resources to care for ourselves and one another. And it's what we want more than anything. And the thing is that fascism arises in these moments because it tells the story that if you sacrifice these other people, you will have time to care for yourself and your loved ones, right? Or the government will care for yourself and your loved ones, or you will come into some, right? But you have to sacrifice these other people. And it's okay because we're dehumanizing them anyway. But it comes from this yearning, right? Of a need that had been long unsatisfied. And so that's what falls to us is to be specific about how that need can be met and how our institutions and our common sense and our relationships can be reconstructed so that that's possible. They can be. It's going to take time. It will be contested. That's politics and that's history and that's okay. But I think that we should be really clear that the solutions being offered by the ascendant authorities at this moment are poor ones and that we should call them out explicitly, and we should not cede any territory. We should not cede any territory to notions that there are those who are disposable. And that I think is the greatest danger because you have so many people who think of themselves as realist or rational or centrist who are willing to cede that territory. But you have to understand that if you do, and this is also something that we know, right? Like it's a truism and it's also empirical, is that when you do that, right? If they come for you in the morning, they'll be coming for me that night. That's the truth. And so that's something that I think we have to understand as an operational truth and not just as a kind of truism or an ethic, and think through, as you say, what it means to build institutions and relationships such that nobody's disposable.
No, I love that. I mean, you put it so beautifully that I don't want to attempt to recap that, but I do want to underscore that that's what I the way that you emphasize it is a politics of care. That's what makes it distinct from just an ethic, from just a personal or emotional quality, but it's about a way that we build a world together in a way that is sharing with everyone rather than the kind of zero sum exclusionary sacrificial aspects of the fascist, ascendant fascist order.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if we're able to build viable institutions that begin to help, not just, I don't mean help people out, sure, I mean, which people can use, right? To see the way toward a different way of being in the world, then people will simply start to use, right, those things because, I think that we have a lot of romantic notions of what revolution is. And maybe it's because the revolutions of, the early and middle 20th century were these, or at least the way we remember them are these sort of like dramatic moments in which power changes hands. And I think that if the basic systems that undergird the way things work are going to stay in place, then you can have that, right? But if what you're doing is building a whole new way of being in the world, then revolution is a process of erosion and construction. And that, I think, is the moment that we're in, is that the 20th century world is coming apart. It's just coming apart. There's regardless, right? No matter what gets constructed in its place, but but there's a way that that erosion can be positive because it makes room for the things that we're building to be of use to people in the new world. And so, yeah, so that is what gives me comfort, even amidst all the chaos and the hurt and the disappointment, which is all real and valid. But it's not the end of the story. We are in medias res, and so what comes next? What are we going to do? What are we going to build? What are the stories that our grandchildren and grand nibblings will tell?
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. I really do thank you so much for coming and sharing, being so generous with your time, with sharing your expertise, and again, such a clear-eyed vision of what is wrong in the world, with also a vision of what we can do about it, while also being so open to the open-ended process that this erosion and construction will be and is. So, thank you so much for talking with me today. Is there anything that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I think I've talked long enough. I just feel really I'm in a moment of zeal, so I feel very zealous about these notions, and I just thank you for the opportunity to be able to share these ideas. And yeah, I guess I just also just want to share a sense of encouragement with people, and um, really say that we all have work to do from where we are. And the work we have to do doesn't have to be someone else's work or heroic work, or, it's just about what we can do from where we are, and using our own expertise and talents and relationships to live into this vision for what we can make. With that, I hope we could do many things together. And I thank you for this opportunity to share.
I wanted to end by recapping a few of the fantastic insights that Deva shared. She talked about the importance of a robust civil society for democratic politics. She resisted the dichotomy between civil associations and political associations. Civic associations, like churches and unions, not only help members develop skills of deliberation and cooperation, as well as the trusting relationships between people who disagree, but also pursue actions that are crucial for the community, like mutual aid. She argues we cannot compare our current moment to the 1960s because the overall status of civil society is less robust than in that moment, including the actual structures of civil society organizations. So she compares our moment to the early 20th century, when this robust civil society was beginning to be built. I loved Deva's point about how so often discussions about polarization focus on the tone of conversation, and often even engage in a reluctance to talk about certain topics, like police brutality, which prevents us from actually grappling with and attempting to resolve the underlying sources of political and social mistrust. Civil society organizations, as Deva argues, by bringing us together and helping us disagree in a productive manner and build together, helps us rebuild that trust and solve problems together. I really like the language that Deva used here. The need to solve polarization on the front end, not the back end. To this point, social capital is central to studies of collective action and community self-governance, but it can be sometimes conflated with cultural homogeneity. We talked about how social capital is something that we can build and cultivate together, and it can thrive on and benefit from our differences rather than relying solely on similarity. All of these generalizable insights relate to Deva's expert work studying one particular social movement, the movement for Black lives. So I want to recap some of the important features of this movement. It has a semi-federated structure with local and autonomous organizations that are then able to collaborate in what organizers call tables, where they make decisions about particular campaigns. She compares this to the American federal system as well as the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee. People outside of these spaces often perceive the movement only through social media, but those social media conversations are really only a small part of the movement and a tool for communicating the ideas. And part of this is because of repression as well. Despite constitutional protections, social movements in the US have always faced repressive government surveillance. In the first Trump administration, the creation of the category of Black identity extremists and police operations meant that organizers could only really allow trusted members into community spaces, leaving a lot of sympathetic participation to occur on social media instead of direct cooperation. As Deva says, social media is a great tool, but organizing has to happen in person. As difficult as things are right now, it's helpful to keep in mind all the ways communities are coming together to live out a politics of care, such as investments in unarmed service workers to respond to mental health crises, community land trusts, and co-ops. The movement toward treating every person as though they are not disposable, of showing care for each other, not just interpersonally, but also through the actual structure of institutions. And these actions can all take place at the local level. I'm so grateful to Deva for the fantastic conversation, and I'm so grateful to you for listening. Till next time.